So I want to say three things. Two of them I think can be treated reasonably briefly, and then the third, of course, is the biggie. The first is that, and this has been said already, and actually you've alluded to it already in what you're saying there, Lee, that teacher quality is the key issue here if we're talking about enhancing the quality of systems, and if we're talking in particular about closing the gap that is a result of social inequality. So we know that the difference between good and bad teachers is large, and various different ways of quantifying that are out there. It's definitely true. Quite how big it is, we could debate about that. We also know that it's socially progressive, that there's more benefit for children from poor backgrounds to having a good teacher, or more damage is done by not having a good teacher, if you like, if you don't have that additional social disadvantage, if you don't have social advantage. If you have social advantage, it's not so much of a big deal. You're perhaps more resilient. I think there's good evidence to support that. And the crucial thing about teacher quality as well is that this actually can be changed. So this isn't what a colleague of mine calls so what variables. This isn't something that describes a lot of difference in the system and we can't do anything about it. Which you might argue poverty, for example, is one with maybe limited power to change that, certainly from within the education system. But we do know that there are all sorts of things that can be done to change the quality of teaching, certainly for individuals. So that's point one. Teacher quality is the key. I don't think anyone's going to argue with me about that here today. Number two is that we already have enough knowledge to be a basis for decision-making and action in this area. So that's not to say that it wouldn't be nice to have more knowledge, better research, more evidence. I'm bound to argue for that. But I think if people say the reason we're not better than we are is because we don't know enough about it, I think they're wrong. I think we know enough to start doing things better than we're doing them at the moment. And that's to say, when I say we know enough, I mean people like the people in this room here today, because obviously you're all highly informed and engaged with these issues, and you read all the research and you talk with school leaders and policymakers and so on. So we're all familiar with that knowledge. That's not to say that in our schools today, if you went into classrooms and you talked to teachers, that practice would be in line with what that evidence says. That's a very different issue. But the problem there isn't, do we have the right evidence, do we have the right research? The problem is about making that widespread, communicating it, embedding it in practice, or whatever you think. Dissemination, I guess, is a word that's used, but that doesn't really capture it. And the kind of knowledge we have is about learning and how that happens. Cognitive science, if you like, it covers a lot of that. The knowledge that we have, and that's an area that I personally haven't done any work in, so I can't make any claims there. But there's some good reviews of what we know about learning and memory and how instruction should be optimised to make that happen as well as possible. Again, as I say, it isn't in line with what many teachers do, but the knowledge is there. We also know about the impact of different kinds of interventions, like investing in class size or whatever, and mostly that's captured in the toolkit, which Lee mentioned. Obviously, other reviews are available. We also know, I think, a fair bit about instruction and pedagogy and classroom practice. And again, that's captured in the review that we did, the second review that we did for the Sutton Trust, What Makes Great Teaching. And again, other reviews are available, and there's plenty of good sources there, I think. And again, what we know is not well aligned with what is common in many schools. And there's a fourth area that I think we know quite a bit about, which is the process of teacher development itself. And what kinds of, how should we shape and frame and design development and learning experiences for teachers that will have impact on their students' learning and outcomes. And I'd say of those four areas I mentioned, that's probably the weakest one in terms of the evidence base, but even that falls into the category of, yes, we know enough to do better than we're doing at the moment. And we did a review, I say we, that was me and Steve Higgins and some others, this time not for Sutton Trust, sorry, for another organisation, summarising that evidence about developing great teaching, I think we called that. So we stole the title and sold it to someone else.
Right.
Yeah, sorry about
Typical
that.
academic.
But again, and that probably in that one, we're further out of line even between what the evidence says teachers' professional learning should look like and what the experience of most teachers in the UK is. And it was quite interesting listening to Andreas, and he didn't kind of get into that in a big way, but a lot of things he was saying, and I imagine things that Charles might say, for example, where other countries are much more in line and probably doing much more sensible things than some of the things we've traditionally done in England. Okay, so that's my first 2 points. One is that teacher quality is key. Number 2 is that we know enough. Number 3 is that the difficult bit of this is not anything that researchers can help you with. Because, as I say, I think the research is there. It's the human stuff. It's about scaling this to a system-wide change, how to get people to change their behaviour. I mean, not to say there aren't some areas of research that, you know, you can look at behavioural economics and stuff like that. That will probably help you. But it's not people like me who know about education. And the whole issue of quality enhancement and how do we build the quality of a system. So if we're thinking about improving the quality of teaching across a system, there's a whole series of things we might do. And we've talked quite a bit about today about recruitment. How do you make it more attractive? How do you get more people wanting to do it? So people have said some quite interesting and useful things about that. We've also talked a little bit about selection. In other words, how do you pick the best people from those who want to come in to make sure that you make the best choices there? And I think what Norman was saying about that is broadly right, that there are quite small gains to be had, but maybe small gains are all we're going to get here. So I don't think we should dismiss them. We've also talked a bit about targeting, so the idea that you work with a fixed sum of quality within the system, but you make sure you put the best people in the situations of most need. And again, people have had various different ideas about that, and I think some of those are quite interesting. We've talked a bit about the kind of outflow side of teaching in terms of retention. The idea that you try and keep people in once they're in and they're trained and they're experienced and they're performing well, that we actually do have quite a high attrition of teachers, and maybe there are things we could be doing about that. The one we haven't talked about is, I've been struggling to come up with a good word for this and a suitable metaphor. Best I can do, I think, is something like filtering, but really this is about sacking bad teachers. So let's just call it what it is. And quite interesting, none of our American colleagues have mentioned this, but I'd be quite interested to hear some experiences there, because there seems to be quite a big debate going on and interesting stuff. Have we not mentioned that because we're just avoiding, is that the elephant in the room? Or has it just not come up yet? I don't know. And the last bit of that, though, and in a way the most important, is teachers' development. In other words, what Dylan Williams calls the love the one you're with strategy, which is about taking the existing teachers you've got in the system and saying, well, what can we do to just make every one of those just a little bit better each year or each term or each month or each week than they were last year or last term or last month. And it seems to me that's the really big game where the most benefits are likely to be had, where the biggest change is probably needed, so therefore it's the most difficult perhaps in many ways, but where also the prize is greatest, and therefore that's the one. And also I think that one spills over in terms of if you get that right, then actually you make teaching a much more attractive proposition, and therefore your recruitment becomes easier as well. And it also, the issue of filtering people who are not performing well also probably is enabled by good professional development and support and so on. So actually I think that's the bit that binds the whole thing together, and that's really the kind of one take-home thing that we ought to be thinking about.
Okay, thanks, Rob.